Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest is Ambassador David Gross, who is partner at Wiley Ryan here in DC. Ambassador Gross has a wide and distinguished record and resume, including U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy at the Department of State from 2001 to 2009. That's quite a mouthful.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the longer your title, the less power you have. As president is easy.
So let's start with a basic question, or an easier question, and we'll go from there. What got you to the position you're in now? Your background, what led you to the Department of State in that role?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Mike. It's really wonderful. And as you know better than anyone, it's David, not Ambassador Gross. So it's terrific to be with you, and it's wonderful. And thank you for asking me to join you today. I've been practicing law a long time. I graduated law school in 1979. So for many people watching this, that's truly ancient history, and I realize that. I practiced law. When I went to law school, I didn't want to actually be a lawyer. I had no interest whatsoever in being a lawyer. I went to law school largely because I was interested in public policy issues. So my thought would be to do government service. That was the reason I went to law school. And the reason I came to Washington immediately after law school. I was told by people who were much smarter than me that I should go to a law firm for a year or two in order to get good training and then go into the government service. I will say that Betsy, my wife, who you know well, really agreed with that because she thought I should earn some money since we were completely broke at the time. That would seem like a good idea, and law firms paid better, as they do today, than government service. I ended up being at this law firm, not Wiley, but a different law firm here in Washington, for 15 years. And the reason I stayed for 15 years is I started off doing energy work. That was the hot issue, as it still is, from a public policy perspective. But there was a guy at that firm who did broadcasting work, and he was a really interesting guy who made violins, spoke Latin, a really interesting character, not a normal lawyer, and he was a broadcast lawyer. And so he asked me if I could help him on a project, and I wanted to do that, not because I had any interest in communications at all, but because I actually wanted to work with him, because he was an interesting guy. This was probably about 1980 or so. So I learned where the FCC was located. That turned out to be important because technology was changing. And so the US government, the Department of Justice, announced the breakup of AT&T, the settlement of that case in 1982. So all of a sudden there were new entrants into the telecom business where once upon a time that was a very sleepy part of the communications world. They broke up AT&T in '84, and one of the FCC commissioners, one of your predecessors, a woman by Ann Jones, came to that firm, and she and I really started the telecom practice. And my contribution was at least I knew where the FCC was located. That was about my major contribution. But we were able to grow the practice because there were lots of new companies entering. And so I ended up growing the practice, being there for 15 years. Then I got a chance to go in-house with one of our clients. The company became AirTouch Communications. And this is where I'm getting to the answer to your question. It had two things. It was wireless and international. And so I got involved in-house doing international as well as the wireless licensing. And then when we got bought out by Vodafone in 1999 and 2000, we grew it to be the world's largest wireless company. Vodafone bought us. So I had a strong interest in international that way. I had lived abroad when I was a small child as well, so I had some familiarity with the international world even before that. And then as a result of retiring at the time, I was able to work on then Governor Bush's campaign and worked with a number of people who later on became commissioners at the FCC and elsewhere. And that's how I got involved. And then I was able to go to the State Department after working on the campaign.
And what do you spend most of your time on these days? And does it allow you to interact after State Department time with foreign governments, or do you lobby or to interact with politicians here in DC?
Yes. I don't do lobbying work or that class of thing, although lobbying is a technical term, of course, as we know very well, but I don't do that type of work. But having been at the State Department for virtually 8 years, which is a long time. Usually, as you know, politicals at places like the State Department, particularly when you get a juicy title like ambassador, they like to have you leave after 3 or 4 years. And the president was very nice, and his staff was very nice, and allowed me to stay for all 8 years. As a result, I've established these great relationships globally with governments and others. And I wasn't sure when I left the State Department whether or not it would be, thank you very much, never see you again, because you're no longer representing the United States, which I have to say, and you know this so very well from your experience, there is nothing better than government service and representing your country. But it turned out that in our area, communications particularly, and international in particular, once you're a member of the club, you're a member of the club. And so I've been able to keep those relationships, both here in Washington, but importantly around the world. Now for, since 2009, it's been a long time.
So as you mentioned, a lot of your work is international communications. Maybe we'll get to some substantive issues. Take us through the process for World Radio Communication Conference and the preparatory side as you did your work at the State Department, and what has happened since.
Sure. Well, first of all, the WRC, the World Radio Communications Conference, is held approximately every 4 years. It's not on a regular schedule. It is done by the International Telecommunications Union, which was established in 1865 to do international telegraphy and also telephones back in the day. One of its core responsibilities is international spectrum. So the FCC, your old home, has complete authority over spectrum allocations within the United States. But it's through the, in essence, treaty process internationally, where the world gathers every 4 years or so to discuss the international allocation of spectrum, which is important both for use of spectrum that's truly international, beyond borders, like satellites, for example, but also to try to get as much harmony in spectrum use as possible, so that companies can have the scale and scope advantages of lower cost cell phones and things of that nature. So when I was at the State Department coordinates, and one of my titles was U.S. coordinator. So I coordinated the U.S. international spectrum policy for the country. We have the FCC has the authority for commercial purposes. NTIA, part of the Department of Commerce, of course, has responsibility for federal uses and other governmental uses of spectrum. So somebody has to play umpire there, and that's the State Department's role. So we asked NTIA, FCC to each have groups to prepare, to do the technical engineering work and the like. And then where they agree, umpires don't need to play much of a role, but then when they don't agree, lead the process within the U.S. government to try to figure out what the right answer is for the country overall. So I had 2 WRCs that I was responsible for. As is traditional, I delegated that responsibility because it's a full-time job that takes the better part of a year, and I had other responsibilities as well during that period. So I had 2 people who get the rank of ambassador to head up those delegations in 2003 and 2007. And I would say that a lot of the same issues that we have today are the issues that were being dealt with then. Very complicated technical issues. They're not easy. It's not just a question of you're right and wrong. It's usually trade-off questions. But the issues about spectrum use for satellites, orbital slots for satellites, issues for terrestrial cellular, there's just not enough spectrum to go around for everything, so it's hard choices that have to be made both domestically and internationally.
Did you find yourself getting along with your 2 delegation heads, Janice Obuchowski in 03 and Richard Russell in 07? And is there natural, and I don't want to call it tension, but is there, you were in this permanent position, right, and you have a delegation head come in for such a short time period. Yeah. Is it a problematic at all?
In my case, the answer was no. Both were very experienced. Both were terrific people, are terrific people, and they did wonderful jobs. I might have been upset if they didn't do a wonderful job, but they did a wonderful job for America. Both were very successful. in very difficult and controversial times. As you can recall, in 2003, we were just in the middle of major difficulties in the Middle East. So talking about spectrum, which can be used for military purposes during that period of time, very controversial. And the same was true in 2007. Perhaps not quite in the same sharpness, but the same types of issues. So very difficult times and challenges for all of us. But they did a great job. And from my perspective, thank God they did such a great job for the American people, and I didn't have to step in. It's a wonderful thing.
You've been around WRCs for quite a while now. What is your take on the success of WRC in recent years of harmonizing? You talked about the international aspect of it and how your days it was a Middle East issue,
right.
and certainly that still pertains, but you also have a number of different hotspots in the world where there are heavy WRC member participants.
Yeah, you know, it's a fascinating, maybe almost unique set of challenges. On the one hand, the core of the challenge is really engineering. And therefore, between these WRCs, there is a tremendous amount of basic engineering work that's done to try to figure out where the interference issues are, what the opportunities are, what can be fit in, how do you harmonize the various challenges, the various uses that are used, and harmonize those. So at one part of the spectrum is this engineering, and it's a bunch of engineers who need to do it. The other side is, as is true for anything of importance globally, it's political. It's political because of the economic repercussions, because of the national security. I mentioned before the fact that spectrum is used by the military, and I would say that's increasingly important. It's always been, but it's certainly increasingly important as you hear about drones and things of that nature. It's important for satellites that are both commercial and for military purposes. It's also very important, just the economics. Countries' economies rely on spectrum and how it gets used and how a spectrum gets allocated. So you have at these conferences a fascinating confluence of technical and political, and of course, underlying it all, economic sets of challenges with differing countries having fundamentally different views. And so finding common ground so that the world, the global community can move forward is a challenge of creativity as well as from an engineering perspective. It'll be that way when we have our next WRC in 27. It is therefore one of the most important, but also one of the most challenging sets of international challenges in the technical area.
So let's get into WRC a little bit further if we can. What is your take on the selection of the U.S. Head of delegation?
Right.
Is there a better process that we could do on that? And then how do you view the WRC process working? A lot of different ideas have been bandied about over many years, and how you would fix it or twist it or turn it. What are your thoughts?
So everybody would agree we ought to be able to pick our WRC head earlier in the process. It's important that we can't, it's very hard for us, I think, to have a permanent head of WRC for a variety of reasons. It would have the advantage of continuity, and many governments do that. But in our system, there's a political aspect of it that I think is important. The person who heads that delegation, because of the difficult trade-offs that have to be determined from our U.S. domestic policy before you even go abroad, it's important that that person have a set of relationships, political relationships, with the White House and with the heads of the various agencies that are involved, so that they can find that common ground. So I think it's important. So what that means is you can't have a permanent head, in my view, that would be as effective. The team around that head is quasi-permanent, and that's very important. We have a lot of great experienced civil servants who play a critically important role there. In terms of how long you have to do it, there's a fight in every administration. There's an attempt to try to name that person early. And inevitably someone in the White House, and this is very bipartisan, says not quite yet, because we need to figure out who to choose, and there's a lot of trade-offs in that. So it becomes a little more complicated. And so that person usually gets chosen later than might otherwise be the case. It's never really been a huge problem. I would say at our the last WRC, if there was going to be a problem, it was most likely to be Ana Gomez, now Commissioner Gomez, was chosen in a timely fashion and did a spectacularly great job of organizing it. But she then was nominated by the president to become an SEC commissioner, so she could not do it towards the end of the process, which could have been in other situations a disaster for us. It was not. It was handled very, very well. Steve Lang, who's now Ambassador Steve Lang at the State Department, stepped in and did a absolutely first-rate job of heading that delegation, showing actually someone who's a good foreign service officer knows how to handle these international meetings. So, I'm hopeful that the president will pick somebody early in the process, to give that person enough time to work the mechanisms that are there, not only domestically but then internationally, because we have a lot of very complicated issues at the next WRC. But time will tell if that happens.
Would you change things about how WRC itself operates, separate from the pick of the delegation? Would you've been around a bunch of WRCs, you've seen how they operate, their pluses and minuses for different pieces. And then is there still value when we look at the geopolitical world in these international communications negotiation organizations, the ITU itself? Is there still value? Does it help get you to harmonization, or are we just showing some cards and people are getting an opportunity to hang out in a lovely city?
Well, sometimes it's a more lovely city than other times. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. The ITU, which, as I mentioned before, is a long-time institution and is an affiliate of the UN. If we didn't have it today, which we do, we'd have to invent it. And the reason I say that is, although the FCC and NTIA for governmental purposes have the rights to do whatever they want within our borders with regard to spectrum allocation and assignments, you would have to have some sort of mechanism for global spectrum use, because it involves not just those on our border, like Canada and Mexico, for example, but also for orbital slots for satellites. That is a global resource. No one country has authority over that. So you need to be able to go to a place where you can get global buy-in to make sure that those things are harmonized. You can't have multiple satellites in exactly the same location. They crash into each other. We don't want that. It's in no one's interest. So in terms of the ITU, I feel strongly, and I think almost everybody does who looks at this issue, that we would need to have an organization like the ITU make those types of decisions. It's particularly important, I think, for us right now, because the head of the ITU is a woman by the name of Doreen Bogdan Martin, who's an American. It's the first American we've had as Secretary General, the very first woman to be Secretary General of the ITU. The ITU, that position is elected by the governments of the world. She will be up for re-election next year at what's called a plenipotentiary conference.
Qatar, right?
It'll be in Doha, Qatar. Yes, exactly. And so the hope and expectation is that she will be re-elected. That's important because we have an American heading that organization. Her predecessor was Chinese. And so without trying to throw any stones at anybody, one can expect that there are aspects of how you make decisions at these organizations that are based upon your nationality and your political affiliation. So having an American head up the ITU is critically important. Even if she's neutral, it's good to have your neutral rather than somebody else's neutral. So I think in terms of that process, I'm very comfortable having it continue the way it has.
There's talk that WRC, the next WRC doesn't have a home yet.
Yes.
The Plenipot, as you mentioned, does, a selected city and country, but the two leading candidates seem to be a race between Rwanda and China. Yep. You just mentioned some some interesting geopolitical issues as it relates to China. How would that play into a WRC going forward?
So, yes, and this is a very, as you can imagine, China loves to host these types of things and has made a very strong case to host. I'm told Shanghai has got terrific facilities for it and so forth. But it is China, and we all know the challenges that come, not just for Americans, but for many others to be operating there. There are security issues, there are communications issues, and so forth that are really quite substantial. I'd also note that the host government has the opportunity to chair the WRC, and so that becomes an important piece of it, because the chair obviously plays a critically important role in how controversial issues get resolved. Rwanda has a great history of hosting international events, including ITU-related events. They are very good at hosting. The challenge, of course, for them, one of the challenges is that it's not as easy to get to. You can get there. I've been there a number of times, and it's a terrific place to go, so I support that. But there is actually a third possibility, and the third possibility would be Geneva. So at Council, which is the sort of board of directors of the ITU, elected board of directors, they'll be meeting in June. This will be one of the decisions they're going to have to make, because it costs money to go to Geneva as compared to where you don't have a host. And the ITU has, as almost all international organizations, major financial issues. So it'll be a challenge for them, but at least Geneva is historically known as a neutral site.
Fair enough. One of the last issues for WRC has been 5G and the ability to have enough wireless frequencies for domestic offering of 5G. What's your take on how 5G has been deployed, say domestically and then internationally? Was it overhyped? Has it been a success? Is it a wild success? Right. Where would you scale it in the overall scheme of things?
So I guess two things. One is in terms from an international perspective, there has been a lot of allocation of spectrum by governments in 5G, and it's been, as you point out, a source of a lot of discussion and debate at WRCs and the like. And there will be discussion about that going forward, and now you'll start to hear discussion about 6G.
Right.
Some of us would like to get rid of these numbers because it's getting a little old, but nevertheless, you'll see a lot of discussion about that. Because again, it's trade-offs, as we discussed before. I don't want to talk about 5G spectrum domestically other than to sort of agree with everybody that we should have more 5G spectrum. Where it gets tough is where it comes from, because it is a bit of a zero-sum game. So I'll leave it to others to figure that out. I was just in Europe a couple weeks ago at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, and I had the honor of chairing a 5G panel with industry and with government people and the like. And it is, I would say, there's still a lot of excitement about 5G and the promise. And AI plays a role in that. We'll still see how some of it gets used. A lot of discussion about the private uses of 5G spectrum, not just for traditional commercial public uses. Europe, they would say, is way behind us on 5G. China arguably is where we are, maybe even ahead of us, if you look at certain aspects of deployment of 5G. And the repercussions of where you are on this are pretty substantial. Same thing true. India's making great progress in that area. Yeah, Africa, not so much. So it's very different as you look around the world on deployment of 5G.
There seems to be a rush to 6G, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
What do you see when you have your crystal ball? What are you envisioning in 6G?
I don't have a clue. One of the things I've learned over these many years is predicting the future is, especially for technology uses, is a fool's errand. When we were first involved in going from what was then called 2G, which was the first wave of digital, analog was 1G, going to 3G, nobody knew what those uses would be. It was really a question of having more efficient spectrum use, which everyone agreed we needed to have because of the great increase in usage of wireless, which we see today as well. But nobody knew that people were going to be able to use it until the Apple phone, really. the iPhone, until be able to access the internet, doing it in ways. And all of a sudden, 3G exploded because all of a sudden people could use it in ways that were not just voice. It used to be voice was the killer app, and that was what was all that really mattered. And then when we went to 4G, nobody predicted that Uber and all the other types of geographically based services would be the killer app for that, and was made available for that. So I've given up trying to predict the future. All I want to do is help others facilitate the future, however it turns out.
Fair enough. As I recall, not only do we want to spend all our time on WRC, but you actively involved in international communications on many fronts. One of them is ICANN.
Yeah.
You're a frequent visitor to the ICANN conferences, as I understand. And maybe take the audience through what is ICANN, and how has it changed over since, in many years? Do we still see a value in this kind of international multi-stakeholder organization?
So ICANN was initially a creation of the U.S. government. When the internet was first put together, you can go back a long time, but let's just focus on the early 90s when it really started to become commercially interesting, as well as from something that government and academics used. It was created for a couple of reasons, but probably the foremost reason was that the internet, and without trying to get too wonky on these things, but the internet is based on an addressing system, and the addresses are really a long series of numbers, a little bit like your telephone numbers, only longer and a little more complicated. And nobody could remember those long numbers. I can't even remember my phone number half the time now. And so there was a very clever approach of translating names, like Google.com, into these numbers. And in order for the internet to work, and what makes one of the things that makes the internet so incredibly successful is that there has to be in essence, one phone book, one book of truth that says this name goes with this number, so that the routing of when you go to Google, no matter where you are in the world, goes to the right place. And if I wanted to email you, it goes to the right place, and so forth. And so you need you can't have multiple organizations doing the same thing, or you may have conflicts. So you need to have one organization do this, and originally it was part of the US government. Then the US government privatized it during the Clinton administration in 1998, created ICANN as a nonprofit California-based organization with a contract to the US government through the Department of Commerce. That went up until the Obama administration. When I was there, I made sure the Department of Commerce did all the work. Department of State, we tried to stay out of this issue as much as possible, except we had a couple of big UN heads of state summits, the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society, very controversial, because the rest of the world wanted to take over ICANN, and my job was to say no and hell no, which we were successful in doing. But then during the Obama administration, what they decided to do, very, I think, wisely, was to, in essence, privatize that completely and have a lot of the safety net that the U.S. government provided be done through a set of legal requirements, basically bylaws. So it now is its own organization. There is a role for governments, for advisory role, but that's it. It's open to every. But it is still a bottoms-up multi-stakeholder, which means it's all consensus-based, not government-run, and it still plays an extraordinarily important role in terms of trying to keep the internet stable and safe for users.
So that gets me to my next question. The internet was of the belief that you could not turn it off. That nobody would have, no one could disrupt it. It was architecturally designed so communications could get through in all types of circumstances. Right. And yet, recently, in the last number of years, we've seen countries be able to turn off their internet, maybe at their border or at certain places. Is that surprising to you? And is the internet fracturing, where we're going to have, wide open internets, maybe the U.S. be part of that model, and other countries that have different political beliefs have their own type of internet? Are we fracturing?
So I think the answer is yes, with an explanation of what that fracturing looks like and what it means. There's no doubt that the internet, in terms of the way in which governments are able to regulate it, has shifted from the early days of thinking that, in fact, it was something that was borderless and could not be controlled effectively by governments. And I think the Chinese really were the first to show that with their Great Firewall, in which they basically control the information flows, maybe not completely, but substantially for people accessing it in China. We've seen this movement for governments to shut down for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're academic. During school exam times in some countries, they shut it down because they don't want to have cheating done and so forth. So there's sometimes it's for understandable reasons, sometimes it's for less understandable reasons. And we've seen this in times of crisis, political crisis, military crisis, the same sort of thing. So yeah, it can be shut down. The U.S. position has long been, in a very bipartisan way, that is wrong to do that, that there are other ways of handling it. Free flow of information is critically important. But you're right, technically that can happen and does happen. So that's one aspect of the fracturing. I think the more substantial fracturing is what we're seeing happening now in a variety of ways, which is there is tension amongst the flow of information internationally. Sometimes that tension comes from privacy concerns. You see this with Europe and other countries where their views about privacy are different than in the US and other countries. And so what you can and can't do and what you can and can't say is different. Similarly with Europe and many other governments around the world, they don't have a First Amendment, which makes it very hard for the US government to do things, although recent events shows that sometimes they do it anyway. But nevertheless, it's very hard. Other governments say, no, you can't say certain things that we think are pretty easy to say on the internet. So that creates a fracturing, a more bordered internet than we've seen before. There's been an aspect of this for a long time. Intellectual property has an aspect of this and so forth. But I think we're certainly seeing more and more of that over time. And that becomes a real challenge.
Are there flaws in U.S. internet policy or maybe global policy that Congress or other governments could help resolve, in your opinion?
The answer is always yes, but I think we have to be very careful. So, privacy would be one of the areas. We basically don't have a national privacy policy. There's some aspects that are national, of course, but we leave it to states and others, which creates a lot of confusion internationally as well. What's allowed, what's not allowed, how you treat information and the like. That becomes important. Obviously, intellectual property always becomes an important issue on these things, and there's lots of tension on those interests, both domestically and internationally. AI clearly is a source of great interest, and how that plays out in terms of the internet space will become very important, and clearly is something that a lot of people are focusing on. And the role of government, particularly the role of Congress, becomes very important on how that plays out. Having said that, my instincts over the past 40 plus years has been the government has an important role that it should play, but it should be very careful and judicious how it plays that role. That by and large, less regulation is better regulation, because the technology changes. If you try to micromanage too much to solve today's problems, you create tomorrow's problems, and that becomes a problem. I think our great comparative advantage as compared to many other economies around the world is we allow technology, particularly in this space, to flourish and to innovate and to change and not to be regulated in advance. And that's an important lesson, and I hope we continue to follow that approach.
And I would only add to your great line there and say, we allow technology to fail.
Yeah.
We let everyone to fail, and there's no guaranteed success some will rise and
Yep.
some will fall.
When I would have these discussions now years ago, when I was the U.S. coordinator, and everyone wants to know what the U.S. secret sauce is. Everybody wants to know. The Chinese want to know. The Russians want to know. The Europeans want to know. What's our secret sauce? And we have many reasons for it. It's our educational system. It's the approach that people naturally have of optimism and trying to try new things and so forth. But one of the things that people often overlook in this is our bankruptcy code. We have a system, a legal system, a financial system that does not penalize more than minimally people for trying and failing. That's very unusual. Globally, it's the other way around. If you try something and fail, you pay a big, big price. And that price often lasts the rest of your professional life. That's not the way we do it. So there's a lot of aspects to our secret sauce, and it's really important that we keep them.
All right, last question. When you look back on your distinguished career working on communications issues, international communications issues, does it feel like to you that we are learning from our past mistakes or our past lessons, or are we repeating the same thing? Are you going through the cycle over and over, or are we progressing as a body on the communication sphere?
You know, it's always a tough question to answer because obviously there are some issues that are eternal because they're fundamental issues, many of which we've touched on, and that we ought to always be asking ourselves. There's no easy answer. There are lots of trade-offs we have to make, you know, about innovation, privacy, national defense, the whole set of yards. We have to constantly be grappling with these issues in order to really move ahead. Having said that, it is absolutely remarkable the progress that we, particularly in the United States, but globally, have made on this area. Up until, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, you know, I got into this by accident. And part of the reason I got into it by accident is nothing much really from a legal and a policy perspective had really happened for approximately 100 years before. It was basically a monopoly. It was done by local rate regulation. The technology had improved slightly, but not very much. And you think about what has happened since 1980 to today, there is almost nothing about that world, today's world, that we saw back in 1980. And when you look back at 1980, you think that's a world that seems 19th century, not even 20th century, in so many respects. I'll give you one example. We all grew up, I at least grew up, with phones that had lines, landline phones, and that's everyone had it. Everyone had a number that was shared by the family, if not a bigger group. That was basically it, and the cost was really high. I could only call my grandmother, my family could only call my grandmother, who lived in another part of the country, for 5 minutes on a Sunday because the rates were low. Today, my grandkids can call me anywhere in the world for virtually zero marginal cost, and they are unhappy unless they can see me because they're on FaceTime or one of the other apps so that we can actually see each other. They don't understand why anybody would talk on a device without actually seeing the other person. That is a world, no marginal cost, real-time global connectivity that was inconceivable just a few years ago. So I am just extraordinarily excited. I think this progress is accelerating, not decelerating. So can you imagine what it's going to be like for my grandchildren when they're, looking back at their career? It will be an amazingly exciting time.
Well, what an interesting picture. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so very much.
Thank you,
I really
Mike.
appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Anytime, Mike. Thank you.